everyone, and welcome. I'm Anna Borshchevskaya, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I am an expert on Russia, and I especially focus on Russia's policy towards the Middle East. That is my main area of expertise. And of course, we are here to discuss the Middle East. So I look forward to a great conversation with you, Sarah.
Hi, Anna. It's wonderful seeing you again. My name is Sara Bazoobandi. I'm a researcher at German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg, and I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Security Politics at Kiel University in Germany. I mostly cover broader Middle East region in the context of political economy. But more recently, over the past few years, of course, because of the dynamics and because of the situation across the region, I also cover a lot of security issues. I'm a native Farsi speaker, so I do a lot of work by default on Iran. And I'm really looking forward, Anna, to this conversation with you.
Great. Well, we of course had an eventful month in the Middle East, and I think it's hard to talk about anything right now other than that's what's going on between Israel and Iran. So perhaps let's start there. What are your thoughts about events of the last 2 weeks?
Yes, as you mentioned, it's very hard to think and talk about anything else but that particular episode. Of course, since October the 7th, 2023, we have witnessed a whirlwind of events that everything is unfolding really rapidly. Uncertainties are higher than ever before. People are finding it difficult to absorb the pace of events that are taking place. Um, but this particular episode, I must admit, I wasn't expecting it to happen. I sort of could see that the tension is rising, but I thought diplomatic track is ongoing, conversations are ongoing between the US and Iran over the nuclear file. Although it's slowly progressing, although Iranians are insisting that we don't want to do direct negotiations, we want to do indirect engagements, and so on and so forth. But for some really strange reasons, the communications and the dissemination of this process with the broader public sort of gave this sense that everything is under control. It might take a little bit of effort, but we are moving away from a full scale crisis and beginning of a war between should it be in the United States and Iran or Israel and Iran. And I sort of did a little sanity check with other colleagues when it happened, and I said I did not expect this to take place. And I could say that the majority of the people that were watching the region and are Iran watchers and analysts of the region were sort of caught by surprise. So that was the most significant element of this that I don't think at least the broader public didn't expect it. We don't know what happened in the conversations. We don't know what was being disseminated through diplomatic channels. But we kept being told that everything is under control. We're making progress, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, when the war broke out, having lived through 8 years of war between Iran and Iraq myself, I was just really at a personal level really severely affected. I have family there, I have friends there. I kept getting deja vus of the days of war between Iran and Iraq. I kept getting deja vus of events in Gaza. Every time IDF announced evacuate this and that neighborhood, within the next hour or so, I just could not help but imagining horrible destructions.
Mhm.
Um, and at the beginning of the crisis, of course, a lot of people were struggling with finding petrol. Traffic jams were horrible to leave the capital. Nobody knew what is the target, what is not. Is it really a carpet bombing? Is it only a specific military site? Is it strategic site? Is it individuals? Because there was a mixture of all of these targets.
Mhm.
And it was really hard to navigate the aim, and I must admit it is still very difficult for me to navigate the aim. I know that nuclear program was the key concern here, but of course, the role of the IRGC across the region, proxies, the support for the Houthis, all of this must have played various levels of role in this. But it's still difficult to navigate what is the final aim. And then the US continued saying that we're not going to engage, we're not going to do anything, we're going to stay out of this one. Again, surprisingly, they did not sit out, and there was the bombing of the nuclear sites. Now we are at this point that domestically, I would say a lot of ordinary Iranians are still recovering from the shock, but also at the same time, even more scared than before because the government started really heavy-handed crackdown under the pretext of we want to clamp down on espionage operations. We want to identify those who collaborated with Mossad and with Israel and so on and so forth. But in these scenarios, we know from experience that a lot of innocent people are just, thrown into this really brutal oppression cycles because the government wants to project power domestically, simply. And I'm sorry, I'm just rambling a lot. You feel
Sure, for
free
sure.
to stop me.
Well, on that, Sarah, let me ask you, one thing that we've been seeing is some of the reports that we've been seeing that it was that the Iranian people were blaming their own government for what happened and for not providing good information to people for where they can go and hide, for
Yeah.
incompetence. And that's something that we see. I can tell you when I was seeing that, I had echoes. So a little bit of that from my own childhood in Russia. I'm American, but I was born in Russia. I left Russia as a refugee. And at times of crises, now this is not to say that these are identical situations by any means. I actually think Russian and Iranian societies that there are a number of differences in terms of public support for the government. From what I've seen, the Iranian government tends to be far more pro-Western than the current regime. It's a bit of a different situation in Russia, I would say. But one of the things that I was thinking about, quite interestingly, is I had flashbacks to some of the traumatic moments in Russia's history where but there were times when the Russian people also blamed their government for mishandling crises. For example, so there's something called the Beslan massacre, uh, and also the Nordost theater hostage taking in Moscow, where the Beslan massacre was a terrorist attack in Northern Ossetia where the Russian government completely botched up the rescue and opened fire on children. And to this day, many mothers who remember this horrific episode, they blame the government rather than the terrorists. So this is a very long way of me saying it was very interesting to observe that from the reports that we've seen, the Iranian people were blaming their own government. Have you seen that as well? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, definitely. Of course, Iranian society is made of nearly 90 million people. There is not one voice and I don't claim that I have such a huge data set to be able to measure the majority of the Iranian population. But at least from my sample size of the data from my network of contact and acquaintances across the country, There definitely was a strong element of that. People compared themselves with Israelis who were in the other end of receiving, this, witnessing and experiencing this war, receiving Iranian missiles and drones. But they were much better looked after. They have very good alarm system. They're trained. They have infrastructure. They have shelters. They experience this in a completely different manner. But the Iranians, no, they were just left on their own. A lot of people speculated that the government wouldn't really mind it if there was civilian collateral damage and casualties, because that would even legitimize the Iranian government's position stronger, and
Mhm.
legitimize it more because look, Israel is the aggressor. They just came out of nowhere. They're killing innocent Iranian people. Um, the other issue was the accuracy of these attacks.
Mhm.
There came a moment that I was begging my family and friend on the phone and through any communication channel that I could find. Like there were days that we couldn't contact anybody inside Iran except for one member of family or one member of the network. Then we would send a lot of phone numbers to that person on WhatsApp or on iMessage and say, call my aunt, call my cousin, call this friend, tell them to leave. IDF gave an announcement, leave, leave. And there were those moments that I was begging my friend and family to leave and to evacuate. And they were so, at some level, they were too content and too confident. They were like, no, IDF doesn't want to kill us. They know who they're after. They know who they're going to target. I'm not saying it's accurate or not, but I'm saying that, perhaps because of the sheer distrust that some of the
Mhm.
Iranians have towards their own government,
Mhm.
they really had much more, perhaps, than it should have been the case under any normal crisis. They expressed confidence in the IDF, which was, to me, it was a very, very unique element, very surreal element of this war,
Mhm.
really.
Yeah, and that's such an incredible observation. I mean, it certainly says a lot about the nature of the Iranian regime and Israel, where you have an oppressive authoritarian government in Iran, of course, and well, Israel is a liberal democracy. And even hearing you make these comments again, it reminds me, it was interesting. I was having this flashback to this episode that I mentioned earlier, the Nordost Moscow hostage takeover. Um, this was, of course, this was another terrorist attack in Russia, but it was completely, again, mishandled by the Russian government. What I remember is at the time, I happened to have known somebody who was so the Nordost is a theater, and there was a play put on. I happen to have known the producer and his daughter, who was an actress in that show. So I remember calling him literally on that day when the news broke out, and he was saying that we don't understand what's happening. The authorities are not telling us anything. That they don't know how to treat people. In the end, the Russian authorities released a gas, and it was some kind of it was an unknown gas. Nobody knew what it was, but doctors who later came to pick up the hostages didn't know how to treat people because they had no idea what that gas was. And in the end, people ended up choking on their tongues because the doctors didn't know that they needed to, I think, put them on their side or something along those lines. Um, and what I remember observing is that everything my friend was telling me at the time, before it hit news, I remember seeing exactly the same thing reported in Reuters several days later. It reminded me again of the nature of these regimes, that this is what they do. They don't protect their own people. They don't care about their people. They're happy to sacrifice their people for a larger
Yeah.
cause. And what always amazed me about Iranians is again that widespread sense of understanding that what this regime is. Um, in Russia, again, the situation has been historically has been different. There is less of a divide between the public and the government than there is in Iran, and that's been fascinating for me to observe.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never, I mean, of course, I'm not closely watching Russia, but I never expected this relationship, especially since the war began in Ukraine, to remain unchanged. And
Mm.
I think this is one of the factors that the Iranian government really is banking on at the moment. And by
Mm.
which I mean, the so-called rallying around the flag, playing with
Mm.
nationalist sentiment of the people. This is something that the government really would thrive on because it helped them a lot consolidating power and establishing this Islamic revolutionary government after, immediately after the revolution, when the war began with Iraq. The founder of Islamic revolutionary system, Ayatollah Khomeini, time and again referred to the war as a blessing, that he constantly in his speeches, he mentioned that this war is a blessing for us, it's a blessing for Islam, and so on and so forth. Nobody at the time really paid attention to it, but in recent years, I see a lot of analysis, a lot of looking back and reflecting on the position of the Islamic revolutionary government towards crisis, towards war. And a lot of people are speculating that perhaps the government really needs at this point in time, an external enemy, an external crisis to create a rally around the flag, to play with the nationalist sentiments of the population, to reestablish itself. Because, for various reasons, various factors played into this for the government to be extremely fragile at this point. The 2022 uprising, economic situation, corruption, the dissatisfaction of the people from all of the aspects of policy making inside the country. And very interestingly, when the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei came out of his silence for more than a week during this crisis, he has only addressed the nations twice. One was at the beginning of the war and word Islam even once in his speech. He greeted the Iranian people using a very similar, very non-Islamic term. In the Islamic term, salam, which comes from Arabic, is the common word for greeting. But durud is a Farsi word, which is completely a-religious. It has no religious Islamic connotation to it. And he started with salam va durud. We started with salam and durud. So he's sort of it was widely perceived as him trying to appeal to the people, use nationalist sentiments. He kept referring to people as Iran, the people of Iran. Before I've done an extensive word analysis and text mining analysis of the transcript of his speeches. Iran has never been a keyword. Iran has never been a most frequently used word by the Supreme Leader, in a sense that he always projected that we believe in the Ummah, we believe in the broader community of the Islamic world, that we are at the front line fighting for for everybody else with the help of our proxies and so on and so forth. So returning back to a nationalist narrative was quite interesting. I don't know for how long it's going to last. I don't know what is the aim of it, but I can see that it has had an impact on, again, going back to your examples of people losing trust in the government. Perhaps the Iranian government is trying to mimic the Russian model to overcome some of these differences, to overcome some of these dissatisfactions amongst the broader public.
That's a fascinating observation, and frankly, it dovetails on Russian-Iranian government cooperation that we've observed in recent years, where both countries learned from each other as you know very well, a whole host of issues, and things like election interference, cybercrime, of propaganda messaging. And here, of course, Russians are masters. So I think it's a very I think it's a very interesting observation that there might have been some of more of that learning. Because of course, as you know very well, Iran early on in Russia's war in Ukraine provided Russia with drones. And so much of the world's attention was focused on military cooperation, and it's still important. But there's so many other aspects of that cooperation that go so much deeper uh, beyond provision of drone technology, which frankly Russia since then has already taken several steps further and reverse engineered. Most of these drones are now produced in Russia. But it's this deeper level of cooperation between these two governments, learning from each other, that's fascinating to observe. And in fact, something else that you said also reminded me of Russia as well when you're talking about the rally around the flag effect. Certainly, this narrative in Russia of being besieged by enemies. This is a this narrative is as old as the Russian state itself. The mistrust of the West, the idea that we're all besieged by enemies, that the West is out to get us, and now is not the time to question anything because we're in a state of war. These are very important parallels between these two governments, and so I would not be surprised if there was more of that propaganda messaging learning that you're describing coming from Russia. And of course, that brings us to another topic of discussion, and that is that many observers had expected Russia to do more to help Iran. And of course, as we've all seen, Russia has, by and large, stayed out of this situation. Russia has rhetorically condemned Israel and offered rhetoric support for Iran, but by and large, Putin, and again, for me, this is kind of I expected this to happen because I follow Russia in the Middle East. Putin made an offer to mediate, but didn't rush to rescue Iran, and there were many questions as to why that happened. But I think it was a pretty predictable outcome. Uh, Russia and Iran have signed a strategic partnership, but it's not a military alliance.
Mm.
It, they're not required to come to Iran's rescue. And in fact, Putin himself said that quite directly that the strategic partnership does not require direct support, and Iran hasn't asked for help. Um, and certainly, to me, what this tells us is, well, there's many directions where we can go from here, but I think it tells us about the different nature of how these regimes view alliances and partnerships. This is not how this is not how liberal democracies see commitments to each other, see relationships. I think, oftentimes in the West tend to use NATO as the benchmark, as an example of an alliance, but NATO is a military alliance. And the nature of the Russia-Iran relationship is far more fluid and far more complicated.
It's absolutely the best way to describe it, fluid and complicated. I completely agree with you. I have been watching Iran, Russia, Iran, China relations for a long time. Um, of course, there was a point that it was mostly crucial for Iran to have partners to serve two purposes. One was to be able to bypass economic sanctions, to find bloodlines for paying government revenue and generating revenue for the government. And the second one was to maintain a position of power and prestige in the international community, to push back against the narrative of isolation and loneliness of the West, to portray itself as a not so pariah state, if you will, by playing with, stronger guys on the street like China, Russia, membership to BRICS, attending BRICS membership to Shanghai Cooperation Organization. even really trying to expand ties with India, with infrastructure investment projects, and so on and so forth. So to find an alternative for the West. But now, I would say post 2018, when President Trump withdrew from the former nuclear deal, known as JCPOA, it became a bit, some elements of the Iranian political establishment became a little bit more outspoken in terms of criticizing Russia's position, to the point that even there was a leaked tape of an interview by former Foreign Minister Zarif, who clearly claims in that, on the record, that Lavrov tried to blow up the deal, the JCPOA. He wasn't going to let us even to have the first deal. We can't really trust that their positioning might be changed. And ultimately, we need to keep in mind that these powers, these global powers, have their own interest. They have their own strategic aims, they have their own expediency, and they're never going to put us above all of their other priorities. So I think as much as Tehran tries to use and utilize its so-called strategic relations with Russia and China, they deep down they know that there is a limitation to the support that they could get from these global powers for all of those understandable reasons. Now, having said that, there was a lot of speculation, jokey, in a jokey way and in a serious way, especially it circulated across social media, that Khamenei and his family escaped to Russia.
Yeah. There were lots of
There were
memes to that end.
yeah,
Yes.
there are lots of memes that were saying that Putin is showing the flat opposite Bashar al-Assad
Yes.
and is saying that it has a nice view, don't be scared, move in, and so on and so forth. So, and I don't think that is completely unrealistic,
Mhm.
because if there was a point of toppling the regime, the current elite has to escape somewhere. Obviously, they can't go to London. They can't go to Paris like the previous royal family moved to Europe. Ultimately, the former Queen of Iran is residing in Paris for many years. I don't think that would be an immediate option, at least for the Islamic
Mhm.
Revolutionary Government elite. So there is an element of truth. There is an element of trust, but the extent is still ambiguous. But we learned also equally from Syria that Russia, if it perceives it's in its own interest, might make bigger intervention. Of course, they have bigger fish to fry in Ukraine. They might be a little bit stretched in terms of the resources. But I wouldn't completely rule that out. But I think that it was a strong signal also to Tehran, um, that if you want to sort out your problems, you have to sort it elsewhere. It's not in Moscow that you can find, resolution to, especially to the nuclear program.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. By the way, I those memes, that you're referring to, I remember seeing actually a triad of Bashar al-Assad, Khomeini, and former
Yeah,
Ukrainian President Yanukovych sitting across from the Kremlin.
yeah.
I agree with you. I would not rule out such a scenario. I also did wonder if Russia could potentially do more to help Iran as these events
Mm,
develop. And something you said I think, is also important, and that is potential regime collapse in Tehran, because for all of Russia's, well, put it this way, Russia is prioritizing its own self-interest. I think that that's what you and I are both saying. But
mm,
Iran turning pro-Western is is not something that Russia would want to see. Russia was never as concerned about the Iranian nuclear program. In fact, they helped build Iran's nuclear program in the first place. They're the ones who helped build the Bushehr nuclear reactor. Um, and they've always acted as Iran's lawyer on the international stage by saying that the Iranian nuclear program is quote unquote peaceful and concerns about their program are overblown. But Iran turning pro-Western is a genuine fear that the Kremlin has, and I think it's because they know history very well. They remember that there was a time when Iran was pro-Western, not that long ago. It's not an inconceivable scenario at all. And if Iran were to turn pro-Western, that would uh, that would be a big strategic blow to Russia's position in the Middle East and to its broader geostrategic designs of what Russia wants to accomplish, which is to have a different world order as an alternative to the liberal world order that we have today. So while Russia would prioritize its own self-interest, and as you said, they are focusing on Ukraine at the moment. Um, I do wonder. I did wonder as I was watching these events unfold, if they could maybe do a little bit more in the event of regime collapse, because that would be a big loss
Mm.
for the Kremlin. But of course, what we've seen is so far that has not happened. This regime is coming out as weakened, but is in no danger of collapse from what we see at the moment, at least.
Yeah, and I think that's the only thing that perhaps the US and Russia agree on over Iran, that nobody wants to topple the regime. Perhaps for various reasons, the enemy that we know is better than the friend that we wouldn't know. Who are we going to leave the future of nuclear program with? Who are we going to leave the future of missiles program with? Iran is formed of various minority groups. They all have their own grievances. Maintaining order might be too difficult. Like President Trump clearly mentioned that it's going to be very chaotic and it's going to be very difficult. Therefore, I'm ruling that option out. Um, but of course, in all of these conversations, what really pains me is that the Iranian people have no agency. They are
Mm,
caught in between a very brutal regime and a few superpowers and a very strong military power in the region, being Israel, that they are pushing for their own agenda. And if Iran has ever been to be defined as a strategically lonely, I would say it's the Iranian people at this particular moment that are strategically lonely. They are seriously lonely and unprotected, No, they don't, there is no viable opposition, obviously, because, authoritarian regime, that's what they do. Russians, Syrians, Libyans, Iraqis, Chinese, North Koreans, they don't allow, that's one of the reasons that they manage to maintain control, because they oppress any form of opposition. So we don't have any opposition, the viable opposition alternative. Nobody wants a civil war. The foreign intervention from sky, it's only demolishing houses and kills innocent people as collateral damage. Without even achieving anything, the economy is in such a bad shape. There is a serious sense of frustration. There is a serious sense of concern, and this Iranian people not having any agency for their future destiny is really something that really pains me to watch. Being an Iranian myself. Um,
yeah.
Now, I totally agree with you that this is something that might change. The agenda of the superpowers might change. The agency of the people might change. There might be uprising, there might not be. We don't know. It's too early to assess or no one can predict. Um, but regionally, I think, and that's perhaps a good point to move to the final uh, news item that I wanted to discuss, is that the proxy network across the region has been weakened extremely, and the crown jewel of the proxy network was Hezbollah. There was a lot of speculation about Iran's attempt to turn Houthis to a southern Hezbollah and to, use its influence and its military support for the Houthis to continue putting pressure on the West and especially on Israel. But now, future of Lebanon, I think, is very important in all of this. And if Lebanon really bounces back under the new government as a more established, more transparent, more secure nation that has that the Lebanese people have an agency, because there are a lot of similarities between Lebanese people and the state capture that happened in Lebanon and what's happening in Iran. Um, and the news item I wanted to bring is that unfortunately, because perhaps as a method to put pressure on the Lebanese government to convince them to make much more needed reforms, on the 10th of June, EU added Lebanon to a high-risk money laundering list, which is going to make financial transactions for Iran difficult, distribution of fund to Hezbollah or other proxies in the region through Lebanon, again, also more difficult. Um, I was wondering, with post Assad, Syria, with Iran being extremely weakened across the region, um, do you see a sort of decline in Russia's power and influence in the region, which would perhaps to some extent translate to more influence by the West? Because that would, go completely against the new world order that Iran, China, Russia share. The ultimate end game might not necessarily align what they want, what they exactly mean by this new world order, but the common denominator is the weakening of the West. So do you think we are heading towards, because and I'm saying this also having in mind that there were some coverages about new banners, new pictures being put up in public spaces across Tel Aviv that shows heads of Middle Eastern states, and the heading of that banner is we are heading towards a new Middle East. Do you think Russia would allow a new Middle East?
It's a great question, and I will answer it in a second, but I want to highlight something very important that you just said earlier. I think it's worth spending a little bit more time on that, and that is the lack of agency of the Iranian people, and the fact that they really are caught here in the middle. And what you said earlier about the Iranian government cracking down again on their own people, as these events unfold. So you have this a liberal regime who was working towards, who wanted to be backed by nuclear power, and look at how it's behaving, and that doves right into your point about regional issues, because a regime that does not respect its own people will certainly not respect other people. Um, Again, this is how Russia behaved towards its own people, and look at what they're doing in Ukraine right now. So again, a government that does not respect its own people will not act responsibly regionally or globally. It will only bring more death and destruction. And so that delves to your other point, and again about Hezbollah being weakened and hope that we might see a better Middle East. As far as Russia, I have to say I know that there's been a lot of hope in these days, and certainly um, um, it's been wonderful to see such a well executed operation to target the Iranian nuclear facilities. Because again, you're talking about a liberal regime backed by nuclear that wants to be backed by nuclear power. The world would not be safe in such a world. What concerns me is that we may not build on this momentum right now, and that we may, if we stop here, if we don't take steps toward again to keep the momentum going, um, I worry that we might only that we might only give this regime more reasons to accelerate efforts to build a nuclear weapon. And as far as Russia at this stage, again, things are changing so fast, and as you said, it takes time to even to absorb these events. But as far as Russia is concerned, I think that they are. Um, fundamentally their position in the region has not been dislodged as of yet. And that goes again to the fact that the Iranian regime has not collapsed. Um, Russia has built good ties with all actors in the region. They want to maintain good ties with Arab states and with Israel. So they've played this double game where, on the one hand, they had good relations with all actors, and really Russia positioned itself as a mediator. And this is what we started out this conversation with. Russia wanting to mediate as somebody that can talk to all sides. But the fact of the matter is, Russia was always closer to anti-liberal forces in the region, and that is Iran and its proxies, and until December, the Assad regime. Um, so I think at this stage, Russia may sort of some of maybe I guess you can call it some of Russia's luster in the region may have been uh, lost. But fundamentally, Russia is still retains its position in the region. The region will still want Russian weapons going forward. They would still want maintain other ties, and so fundamentally, the this axis of Russia and Iran, and if we were to take a step back and think globally, and that is Russia, Iran, and China. Um, to me, that axis is still in place, even if there was an important setback. And unfortunately, as we think about going forward about how these events are going to proceed, I think that's exactly the bigger picture that we need to think about is the dislodging of this axis. Because again, think about what's at stake. You're talking about global security. You're talking about fundamentally different competing visions of what the world should be. And in my view, liberal democracies have a better vision. What they have to offer is fundamentally better. And what Russia, Iran, and China, what these regimes are offering is a losing vision. Um, but again, to answer your question, because the Iranian regime has not collapsed, think fundamentally there is Russia is not in a bad place in the Middle East. Um, it would again, I don't think anyone really expected Russia to rush to Iran's rescue in this scenario, uh, because knowing what Russia is, knowing that it prioritizes its own self-interest, knowing the different approach to alliances and partnerships that Russia takes. Um, but I guess the other part of your question is if things were to turn to a better place, could Russia potentially do more to thwart these efforts to build a better Middle East? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think they could. They could take more steps. The question is, what would they do? What could they realistically do? Um, and maybe that's again, there's so many unknowns here in a scenario like that. But the reason why I think they could do more is because look at how Russia has empowered Iranian proxies over the last several years, and not only Hezbollah but the Houthis. Look at how much Russia has done to help the Houthis, precisely because it exacerbated chaos across the Middle East. And more broadly, what the Houthis have done is they have shown that with very cheap technology at very low cost, they can not only disrupt global trade, but they can force the United States to expend some of its most expensive weaponry. So this is a very important cost and benefit calculus for somebody who wants to weaken the United States. So of course the Russians were supporting the Houthis. What's I think what would be, and this is maybe kind of a bigger part of your question is what could Russia do in this different Middle East? And the fact of the matter is, I think if if liberal forces were in a better place, in a stronger place, there would be less that Russia can do. Russia tends to come in and really, I guess you could describe it as pouring salt on existing wounds. The Middle East was already destabilized and chaotic. Russia didn't fundamentally come into a stable, secure place and create this instability. What they do is they try to keep that same situation going. The same way what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Why does Russia want to prevent Ukraine from joining the West? Why did Russia start this war? Why did Russia attack its peaceful neighbor? The Russian government wants to see Ukraine weak and destabilized, because a weak and destabilized Ukraine uh, uh, will not, because look, if the Russian people can see that Ukrainians can build a strong and stable democracy, that it could give the Russian people ideas that maybe they too can demand a different government. Maybe they too have a right to live in a better place. That is why Russia wants to keep Ukraine weak and destabilized, why it wants to keep the entire post-Soviet space weak and destabilized.
Yeah.
So this is a very long way of answering your question that I think we are certainly in a different place than we were in the Middle East. We've seen some incredible events, but we're also entering an era of a lot of uncertainty. If the West does not build on this momentum that we've had. I'm sorry, that was kind of rambly. Hopefully, you can cut that out.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you for putting it in such an eloquent way. The one final point I wanted, when on the dissemination, not dissemination, sorry, the diffusion and exchange of knowledge and expertise and methods and weapons and tactics and learning from each other as a strategy. I wanted to add was that the world of hybrid warfare, especially information warfare, disinformation, and discourse manipulation. When you look at the strategies used by these three players, they are very much identical. Iran, China, Russia are doing exactly the same things in those realms. And interestingly enough, recently I read a book about one of the prominent spies of British government that was also working at the same time for the KGB at the time.
Mhm.
And the anecdotal evidence based on historical archive that this author gathered, I'm not going to advertise for the book. Sorry, I don't know what the rules for this podcast are. But if anybody wants to know the name of the book, they could reach out. But the anecdotal evidence of the archival work really struck me that how much Iranian government have studied. There must have been trainings, there must have been official exchanges. This cannot have happened organically. Um, in all of these aspects of hybrid war and information war. And this is, what brings them together. They have understanding about their vision, which is weakening of the West. It's to create chaos in the liberal democratic world. And they use the same textbooks. So, and I completely agree with you wholeheartedly that so long as there is no decisive response and there is no clear strategy from the West, all of these efforts could just uh, work in a way that they will bounce back. Iranian nuclear program would bounce back even more aggressively, and we will have much bigger certainties in the next episode that we're going to sit down here, me and you, talk about the future of the region.
Sarah, it was a pleasure talking to you, and especially sharing these personal experiences, having both of us having lived in these authoritarian regimes, experienced life in these countries. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time tuning into to our podcast.